The Reconstruction era. This was a time after the Civil War when the South was being rebuilt. Cities, land, farms were ravaged and destroyed all over the South by the Civil War. The South had been reduced to rubble. A lot of whites were left without homes. People would have to rebuild their houses, toil on their farms, and get supplies to stay alive. But there was something else on the white people's mind. A law was now in effect that freed all slaves from their masters. The white people did not take kindly to the blacks being able to run around freely. The whites responded in a negative way. One Republican black man in Georgia was killed by the KKK because he was in support of equality for the blacks. Unfortunately, during the Reconstruction, blacks were oppressed by the white people through laws, supremacy groups, and farmers themselves. The Ku Klux Klan was one of those groups that caused a major problem for the blacks.
The Ku Klux Klan was notorious for persecution of blacks and Freedom Bureau agents during the Reconstruction. The KKK was founded in 1866 by a group of Confederate veterans who were enraged by the freeing of slaves. The organization was formed to resist the Republican Party's Reconstruction policies for giving the economic and political equality to whites. Nathan Bradford Forrest, a former Confederate general, was chosen as the first Grand Wizard of the KKK. The Klan was notorious for violence throughout the Georgia Black Belt. Most of the violence was to intimidate black and white supporters of the Republican Party. Later, the actions of the Klan became more and more common, and by 1869, hundreds of cases of murders of Freedom Bureau agents and blacks were reported. These people oppressed blacks for many years. The white people thought that the blacks were not equal with them. Over the following years, it is obvious that the Southern government shared their views.
Equality between whites and blacks before the Civil War was non-existent. After the Civil War, it didn't get much better. Yes, blacks were no longer slaves to the white people, but how are they supposed to move on when they can't even do the same thing that whites can? The Southern government put into effect laws called the Black Codes that segregated the blacks from the whites. A subdivision of these laws, the Jim Crow laws, stated that schools, restaurants, and even hotels could be segregated by race as long as the service they provided were similar. Even though slaves were free, they were second-class citizens. Some other things that blacks were not able to do was to vote, own guns, own property, and they would even get arrested if they didn't have jobs. Blacks could not even protect themselves from white supremacy groups that were plaguing on them just because they weren't allowed to own guns. They could not own property to make a living for themselves. Unfortunately, because of this, they had to sign unfair labor contracts with the whites because they would get arrested if they did not have a job. These labor laws started a system that really disadvantaged and basically enslaved the blacks again. This system was called sharecropping. Another problem that blacks had was with the policies and disadvantages of blacks from sharecropping. After the Civil War, land and plantation owners were trying to secure a labor force because they needed someone to work their land. Freed slaves thought the government would give them some land because of all the work they did as they were slaves. But for many, this was not the case. That is why the sharecropping system became so popular with the blacks. They could rent from the very owners that owned them, and this was the only possibility they had, because as they were slaves, they were not allowed to be educated or taught anything except farming, cooking, and other field and household jobs. As you can see by this graph, it has become very popular in the South, but the sharecropping system was corrupted and very unfair to blacks. The farmers would often go into debt with the landowners because of tools and failed crops, so the landowners had the ability to manipulate the blacks through force and make them sign unfair contracts. This made it harder for blacks to leave their job because of debt. The whites needed the blacks to work their land, especially the cotton farmers. Cotton farming was the main revenue and cash crop of the South, and farmers needed so many workers to pick, and whites really weren't in the business of picking cotton, so they employed the blacks. The government also helped out the farmers. Because of the Black Codes, the blacks were forced to sign these labor contracts or they would be sent to jail. Life for the blacks during this time was very hard. Some were able to free themselves from these people and leave to find a better life and own land and grow crops, but most couldn't afford to leave and fell into an even greater trap, a trap set by the white man, a trap of work. As you can see, life for the blacks during the Reconstruction was very hard. They were disadvantaged and persecuted by the white men. The whites used the KKK through persecution to enslave the blacks with the fear of torture and death. They used the black codes to segregate the whites from the blacks, often making the blacks go to school, sleep in hotels, and even eat in poor conditions than the whites. And they forced the blacks to stay working for them through the labor laws. The white farmers also had a hand in this oppression of the blacks with their unfair labor contracts and unreasonable crop revenues. The white people responded wrongly to the freeing of the slaves. But why did they respond this way? Maybe some were angry that the North for destroying the South just to free these people. Maybe some were angry that their workers were able to leave, causing their crops to fail and causing them to lose a lot of money. I do not know if we will ever know, but this has caused a major division in our society. Even today, segregation and overall oppression of the blacks still in some shape or form still exists, but America is getting better. We are working toward a better America, an unbiased America, a free America, America that soldiers, politicians, and presidents have died for, an America that was envisioned by the greats. I know that our country will fight for what it's meant to be, a safe haven for all.